This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Noakes, and I'd like to welcome you to our Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System and Southeast Coastal Ocean Regional Association Collaborative Spring Webinar Series. I know you all are probably very familiar with our acronyms, but I like to spell out GCOOS and SECOORA just to make sure everybody knows who we are and what we're talking about. And this is our ongoing webinar series titled Building Synergy Across the U.S. Marine Biodiversity Observation Network and Ocean Acidification Networks, MBON and OA. As you may have been a part of this ongoing webinar series, this year GCOOS and SECOORA have teamed up to develop a webinar series focused on establishing collaborative opportunities between MBON, the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Acidification Network, GCAN, another acronym, and SOCAN, the Southeast Ocean and Coastal Acidification Network. This is our fourth webinar, and we will have one more next month, and that will be the wrap-up of the series. Today, we will be continuing the series by discussing ecosystem services and the blue economy, and we will be hearing from a representative from Coastal New England MBON and from the OA Alliance. So I would like to thank our co-organizers for this series. Having so many people involved in a steering committee for this webinar series has brought in such a diverse crew of speakers. So I do want to just call out the people listed down at the bottom. Dr. Chris Simonello with GCOOS, Jennifer Vreeland Dawson with GCOOS and GCAN, Dr. Emily Hall with SOCAN, Jen Dorton with SECOORA, and myself, and then Dr. Kim Yates with USGS and GCAN. So I will briefly go over the goal of this webinar series. I know many of you have probably been a part of this series already, and you don't want me having to go through it all again. But our main goal is to advance science in support of resource management and the blue economy by strengthening collaborations across MBON and the regional ocean acidification networks, specifically GCAN and SOCAN. I can give you a minute to read over our objectives, but to give you the gist of it, we really are interested in figuring out gaps and needs for marine biodiversity and ocean acidification research and monitoring, specifically in the Southeast and Gulf of Mexico. But today we do have a representative from New England, which will be a really refreshing take on the marine biodiversity crew. And we also want to potentially have a workshop at the end of this or some kind of white paper to bring together all of the really great knowledge that we were able to discover with these awesome speakers that we've had. So the webinar format for this time around, because we have two speakers, we will have two 20-minute presentations, one on ocean acidification and one on MBON. And we will have a 15-20-minute question and answer session at the end. So you are totally welcome to put your questions in the chat as the speakers are talking if you just want to get them out of your brain. But we will not be addressing questions until at the very end when our second speaker is done presenting. All right, so it is now time for me to introduce our lovely speakers today. First, we are going to be hearing about the MBON portion of the webinar. So we will be hearing from Dr. Nathan Furey, who is the assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. Nathan is the lead investigator for the Coastal New England Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, MBON, a project focused on using multiple technologies to characterize marine biodiversity in coastal waters. The project also aims to quantify how two idyllic species, the Atlantic cod and the common tern, respond to local changes in marine biodiversity. For today's webinar, Nathan will discuss potential linkages between marine biodiversity and various ecological functions and ecosystem services. And after Nathan is done speaking, we will hear about the ocean acidification portion of today's webinar. We will hear from Jessie Turner, the Executive Director of the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification, also known as the OA Alliance. Jessie assisted in the creation of OA Alliance, which is an initiative of more than 130 government and non-government members working across 22 countries to increase ambition for climate action and transform response to climate ocean change. She brings 15 years of experience working in policy and initiative development as a facilitator, project manager, and strategist. Jessie's talk today will focus on how communication, education, and collaboration drives OA policy at a national and international level, and how OA policy shapes the path for research that directly or indirectly looks at impacts of biodiversity. So with that, I'm going to turn over the controls to Nathan, and we will hear about Coastal New England MBON.
Realized I needed to unmute myself.
Yes.
Thank you, folks.
That's usually a good idea.
Thank you, folks, for having me today. I'm really excited to share. I won't be too focused on coastal New England. I do have a couple of examples for a couple of points, but I'll also try to speak broadly, but pull in some Southeast and Gulf of Mexico examples too. I'm really fortunate to be a part of the MBON, and MBON wouldn't be possible without the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, and specifically funding through ONR, NOAA, BOEM, and NASA. And then the MBON is also very intimately tied with IUCE, as well as organizations such as USGS and GeoBON. Now, I'm a relatively new PI in MBON. I've been in MBON for about 2 years now. And if I were to describe it, it's a series of projects across the continent and really across the hemisphere to try to better observe marine biodiversity. So it's a series of individual projects with their own PIs and teams, and I'm humbled to be the lead PI for the Coastal New England MBON. But each of these MBONs are trying to measure marine biodiversity using various emerging techniques and tools that we'll talk about in a minute or two. However, they are also a network, so they come together monthly as well as through a variety of working groups and committees to try to create synergistic products and try to better communicate their science. I think if my count is right, Frank can correct me in the Q&A period, but I think we have 10 current active projects, including a couple of brand new ones. But it's way beyond just those 10 projects. MBON is involved with a lot of other efforts in the country and across the globe. In terms of the goals of MBON, they have several. You know, it's not just about generating these scientific observations of marine biodiversity that I'm going to focus on today, but trying to build a global community of practice in terms of how do we do this. And then from not just the building of these networks and sampling protocols, but all the way through how do we treat our data and how do we organize our data and how do we store our data. And then lastly, how do we communicate what we find in an effective manner, particularly to folks who are making decisions? However, given the brevity of this talk and the variety of topics I'm going to try to cover, I'm really going to focus on this observation piece. And how does MBON, what are some of the emerging technologies that MBON uses to measure marine biodiversity? And so I love this image developed by Kelly Lance and Mbari. Regarding different technologies that can be used in our oceans, and it highlights eDNA in particular. eDNA is the idea that you can take a water sample and identify the living organisms that were in that water recently. And it's kind of a gross idea, but it's the idea that as critters swim or as we take a swim at the beach, we're sloughing off DNA the entire time. And we can actually isolate that DNA, amplify it, and determine what species were there. So this is great from a broad taxonomic perspective. We can identify everything from viruses all the way up to whales if they were in that water recently, as well as it's non-invasive. We don't have to actually collect that animal or pull it out of the water to determine its presence. And eDNA, I should say, is widely used across the MBONs. Another widely used technology across the MBONs are passive acoustics. This is just the idea that you put a listening device into the ocean and you listen. And because we have so many sound producing animals, we can actually determine through their calls, their sounds and grunts and songs if they were there or not. Certainly marine mammals and particularly cetaceans are the best known for this, whale songs, but we have a variety of soniferous or sound producing fishes as well as invertebrates as well that can be identified through this technology. Now, while passive acoustics are listening to the sounds of the ocean, we can also use what are known as active acoustics, where we're actively sending out sound beams and listening or detecting back what gets reflected. So this is like kind of scientific grade boat sonar or fish finders, if any of you are recreational fishers. And so you can kind of see this example on the image here, that we get a big cloud showing up on that echogram. And in this instance, they've been able to identify it down to a species. Now, in some occasions, you can identify down to species if you kind of pair it with other validation techniques, or you just have really good understanding of the critters in your environment. But oftentimes, it's not quite at that taxonomic resolution. It's rather, okay, this is a fish that has a swim bladder, or it doesn't have a swim bladder, so maybe it's a squid or something else. Cool technology that's really near and dear to my heart, rather than trying to measure a bunch of species or their biomass that are in a given area. This is more regarding kind of the diversity of behaviors that we have in our aquatic and marine environments. So telemetry is the idea that you can put an electronic tag on or in an animal and then follow its movements around to figure out where does it go and try to understand why. And so in the instance of acoustic telemetry, these are tags that send out ultrasonic signals that we can't hear, but listening devices that we put in the water can hear. There are other forms of telemetry, such as GPS and satellite as well. But through these efforts, we can track the movements of individual animals. And oftentimes researchers are focused on a single species, but as more and more researchers tag different species, and as they put out their own listening stations in the environment, through collaborative networks such as the Animal Telemetry Network, the Ocean Tracking Network and its regional nodes, we can start to piece together the movements of various species simultaneously. And Neil Hammerschlag is leading a BioTrack project that focus on a lot of these syntheses. All these technologies on the screen that are kind of novel or emerging or high tech are very organismal focused or animal focused. However, we do have a variety of sensors, whether it's in situ water loggers, such as the IUS provides, or satellite-based approaches through remote sensing that we can look at things like basic primary productivity and or ocean conditions that are likely driving a lot of the behaviors and the success of the critters that we're measuring with these other modern techniques. And so this gets to the idea of ecosystem functions and services. And so we'll discuss ecosystem functions first. And you can think of an ecosystem function as just simply any process that exists as a part of that ecosystem or promotes that ecosystem's persistence. And I'm going to kind of build up the pieces of this figure from a Barbier 2017 paper. But the first one that's listed there is biogeochemical cycling. And I'm certainly not a chemist, and that's a big word, but we can simply think of it as kind of the different cycles that we have in our world's oceans. And a really important one is the carbon cycle. And so what this very complex image is trying to show is just kind of the world's oceans carbon cycle, and specifically a phenomenon known as the biological pump. And so this is the idea that through a variety of physical as well as biological processes, carbon is moving around. It's moving around our global oceans. But as critters eat each other, and as they have egestion and excretion, as they poop and pee, essentially some of that carbon is going to start to sink, as well as when animals die, that carbon is going to sink. So this pump is a process in which we're taking carbon from our atmosphere and putting it down into the deep ocean. That obviously has some important implications for our globe. And so there's a lot of processes that contribute to this biological pump that we all depend on, but it also relies on the movements of organisms. And so what this animation is showing you is representative of the single largest movement of biology in our globes that occur every day and night cycle. And it's called diel vertical migration. So as we go from day to night, you have all of this plankton that's rising up to the surface to try to feed on phytoplankton under the cover of darkness and trying to avoid predation. And then you've got a whole food web essentially deciding to try to keep pace and migrate with it. And so these vertical movements up and down help pronounce or help promote that biological pump, in addition to things like oceanographic downwelling and upwelling. And so this is a really important example. I use the biological pump as an example of an ecosystem function because it really is reliant on the entire marine tree of life. So everything from microbial activity and single cell organisms all the way up to what we might, myself as an organismal biologist might consider when I think about marine critters in the ocean, all the way up to our charismatic megafauna, such as whales. And we can think about that in terms of some of our technologies that we're using and what types of taxa they're more equipped to track than others. These movements and these interactions in this pump is dependent upon predator-prey interactions and who eats who, as well as grazing on primary productivity. So that flow of energy is going to be really, really key to individual ecosystems, as well as the productivity of those ecosystems too. And those represent kind of really core ecosystem functions that we want to be able to track and quantify and assess changes to. Movements of animals that are affecting all of these things, productivity, flow of energy in particular, aren't just vertical, however. We have animals that move in horizontal space to varying degrees, including animals that migrate really large distances across seasons. So this is from Dr. Matt Ogburn at the Smithsonian, who's another new PI within the MBON, who's done a lot of work tracking the migrations of cownose rays up and down your coastlines in response to seasonal change. And so as they move and they're eating and pooping, they are having effects on ecosystem functions as well. And so again, as we think about those functions, I won't go into detail, but just kind of putting in the back of our minds that each of these different tools or technologies are going to have pros and cons in terms of how well they can track those things. Now, before I move on to ecosystem services, I do want to make kind of an observation or just something to think about in terms of linking ecosystem function and biodiversity, because they don't always necessarily positively correlate. And hopefully I can illustrate that. So for example, we know in general, marine organisms are moving their spatial distributions towards the poles. And so here, if we're looking kind of in the northern hemisphere, in general, organisms are moving to exist in higher latitudes towards the north and in in deeper waters to try to track cooler waters. And certainly here in kind of mid-Atlantic and then up into the Gulf of Maine, we're seeing that. We're seeing the distributions of these critters moving northward. And here in the Gulf of Maine, we're seeing a lot of mid-Atlantic bite species now occurring in the Gulf of Maine, to the point that if we were to actually measure marine biodiversity in terms of species richness, as one metric, for example, we would probably see a bit of an uptick in the biodiversity that we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine. And a natural conclusion or idea that you might have with that is that, well, maybe that's a good thing. We're getting more species here. We're having more biodiversity. Isn't that a good thing? But again, sometimes biodiversity and ecosystem function aren't necessarily directly 100% correlated together. So this is from the National Climate Assessment and modified from an Andrew Pershing paper regarding kind of the ecosystem of the Gulf of Maine, where a couple of our really iconic species that we care about their management and conservation are the North Atlantic right whale that is highly endangered, as well as the Atlantic cod that historically was one of the most important fisheries, if not the most important fishery of our country. cod and right whales might not really benefit from increased species of currents of things like black sea bass, tautog, and long-finned squid. Instead, they're going to care about the things that they feed on that have those really high nutrient densities and really affect their energy flows, speaking back to the ecosystem functions. Atlantic cod are really dependent upon things like Atlantic herring and river herring, while North Atlantic right whale are going to be very reliant on copepods, and particularly Calanus finmarchicus, which Dr. Jeff Runge, a PI for the Gulf of Maine MBON, studies intensely. So we can get a little bit of a mismatch between biodiversity and ecosystem function there, depending upon what services and what we care about, which we're going to touch on next. And this is going to be an ongoing issue kind of across latitudes. So for example, those Calanus copepods that we predict are going to decrease in abundance, Calanus finmarchicus, as the Gulf of Maine warms, well, their abundance is going to decrease here because they're moving further and further up the coast and are starting to persist in Arctic waters. And they're starting to compete with and potentially replace other Calanus copepod species that are larger and have larger lipid reserves for things like polar cod and a variety of other important species in the Arctic. So their ecosystem functions might be changing in response to changing biodiversity as species continue to march towards the poles. So now, sorry for that tangent, I'll bring us back to the idea of linking ecosystem functions to now services. So now ecosystem services are kind of the stuff that humans have identified in terms of how do ecosystem functions help us. So things like fisheries, recreation, coastal resilience, et cetera. And we'll touch on a couple of these. And it's the idea that we call these ecosystem services because they benefit us somehow. You know, we're all part of this economic machine, but that hopefully from the production of goods and services from those ecosystem services, our well-being is also increasing. And so in response, you know, our nation does have some strategies and documents regarding how do we have a resilient new blue economy. I don't know when it became the new blue economy relative to just the blue economy, but I like this quote from Dr. Spinrad in that we're trying to have a knowledge-based economy, looking to the sea not just for extraction, but also for the data information that we need to inspire solutions to societal challenges. And so this new blue economy has several pillars related to, again, a lot of things that that we all think about in our minds, particularly in an era of continued change. And so those pillars, specifically within NOAA's Blue Economy Strategic Plan that runs through 2025, are marine transportation, ocean exploration, seafood competitiveness, tourism and recreation, and coastal resilience. And because I only have about 3-4 minutes left, I'm going to focus just on, you know, fisheries, which are kind of near and dear to my heart and in my expertise. And so obviously commercial fisheries are important to our nation's blue economy, and therefore we want to build some resilience in there and the ability to detect change. Commercial fisheries are specifically fisheries that are done at a commercial scale. So think about all the fish and seafood products you can buy at a grocery store or at a restaurant, or that goes into fish meal or goes into your cat food or dog food, canned products, preserved products, etc. And the Southeast isn't necessarily a super strong player in our commercial fisheries. They're certainly really present and relevant. But I also want to note that of the highest value species group among commercial fisheries, 4 out of the 5 groups in terms of how the National Marine Fisheries Service categorizes these are shellfish. And that's probably going to be important as we transition to ocean acidification. But where the Southeast really shines in terms of fisheries and why this is so relevant to everyone is in recreational fisheries. So recreational fisheries are when people buy a fishing license and go out and catch seafood products, or they go out on a party boat, or they pay a charter to go out and catch individuals. And now we can see those numbers really increase both at the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic Coast level. And the majority of those trips and catch for the Atlantic Coast region are Chesapeake Bay and south. So again, the Southeast is a really big player in recreational fisheries. And if you look at those species that are listed at the bottom, you're going to recognize those as primarily South Coast species. So it's really important that when we're thinking about marine biodiversity observations, how can they be valuable to components of the blue economy, including fisheries? And so in my opinion, these observations can be really helpful in filling in gaps in our traditional sampling. In fisheries, we're relatively fortunate to have pretty robust data sets where we have pretty wide geographical coverage and scientists are getting their hands on fish. That's what I'm trying to show you here with kind of the scope or the extent of the CMAP program along your coastline, but then also kind of our analog, the Northeast Fishery Science Survey, Trawl Survey. And it looks like incredible coverage when you look at it in a static view like this, but these are surveys that happen only seasonally and usually only with a couple of vessels, and so they're moving across a gradient. So you can't get these observations at all places at all times. And these new technologies that oftentimes are cheaper and easier to deploy can help fill in those gaps. They also really help with us understanding where these fished species fall within the food web relative to everything else and tracking those changes simultaneously. So again, something like eDNA that can go all the way down to viruses if you want, you can start to get information on various taxonomic levels that you can't get with a trawl net, for example. And this allows us to integrate new variables into our analysis, particularly with things like remote sensing. Now, I do want to also bring in the idea of ocean acidification. I am not an ocean acidification expert. I'm very glad we have Jesse following me up. But kind of my one comment on this is just that it's, I believe our knowledge on ocean acidification suggests that some species are going to be impacted more than others. So certain organisms like pteropods, sponges, and certain shellfish are going to have direct effects where ocean acidification is going to directly affect their survival or growth. And then we have other critters that might be able to grow out of it. Maybe at juvenile stages, they're going to be more susceptible to direct effects. But then as they get larger, maybe they're going to feel more indirect effects. And then when it comes to fishes, we think most of these effects are going to be indirect. So they're not going to directly impact mortality on these species, but through all of the connections in food webs, they're going to feel some consequences. And that's going to be really hard to predict because of how complex our food webs are, whether you use a idyllic version like this or what's used more in a traditional kind of ecosystem modeling perspective that really shows the complexity. And so with that, I really think the only answers here are to continue and promote long-term monitoring so we can continue to collect data through series of changes, but then follow that up with question-driven analysis. So we need to have flexible data collection programs and technologies that allow us to ask system-specific questions, but then be transferable across coordinated large-scale sampling efforts so that hopefully we can systematically look at change globally. But one of the challenges I see is that a lot of these technologies are still being innovated. So how do we balance that innovation of that technology with the need to try to standardize and have all of our data sets be comparable? And I think we need to focus beyond just the biodiversity, super important to measure, but how can we better quantify change, function, and service? And as a movement ecologist, I'll just promote this idea that movements help link a lot of these functions and services. And we're probably going to need to really understand the ecology and build more mechanistic models. So I know I've gone a couple minutes over. Sorry about that, organizers. So I'll stop there so we can turn it over to Jesse. But thank you so much for your time. And there is my email for any questions you might have after this.
Thank you, Nathan. If you could actually put your email in the chat, that would be super helpful in case we end up not having enough time to address questions or if somebody thinks of a question after the webinar's over. So he's going to put his in the chat, and please feel free to email him any questions we don't get to. Now, Jesse, I would like to turn it over to you and have you present your presentation.
Well, thank you, Emily. Just a quick sound check. You can hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. I haven't timed this, so unlike Nathan's 24 minutes, we'll see, and I will tell myself when we're getting too close for comfort, and we'll make decisions at the end. But I'll have to say, I really appreciate that presentation, and I think, it's a nice, I was curious if the setup would be quite right. As you guys will see from my presentation, I'm quite policy focused and very high level focused, not coming from a science practitioner background, but know, enough to follow along. And also say, I think with the presentation that, was asked of me to think about how does, in this case, ocean acidification policy shape the path for research. I think really where we are with ocean acidification is that policy is shaping a path for research, but also that the research is new. It's a new field, right? And so we are growing the path for research, helping to shape policy. And so we really are in this nice sort of real-time iteration, and that's a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity, I think, in this field to think about how do we co-design with management outcomes positively in mind, right? And so I think that's a really unique space for the OA field to be in. And just to comment on Nathan's presentation and just like MBON partnerships, particularly, I think, what's true, as you described what the goals are, it's sort of like in the context of ocean climate change, where we really need to be building our partnerships and our conversations and our unique set of community of practice around is, how do we measure the right thing in the context of ocean and climate change? How are we putting the right set of data sets together? Are we defining indicators? How are we defining indicators? And then how are we thinking about management response to those indicators? So I really appreciate sort of the emphasis on biodiversity. And I think I really appreciated, Nathan, your point between relative biodiversity versus ecosystem function. I also think a lot about how do we layer on then this complexity around like conditions and trends, and then sort of this added layer of direct biological research into biological and physiological function of species in these different conditions. So holding that all in my brain as I kind of now will share my screen and talk a little bit about how we work through the Alliance to bring governments more specifically into this type of conversation so that they're equipped to have a little bit of give us some feedback around the management and policy that's going to be needed to manage, in this case, ocean acidification. So I'll just quickly say we are the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. I won't kind of go too much into detail about who we are and why we got started. You can find that on our website, but we were launched in 2016. And our mission, as Emily said, is to transform planning and response to climate ocean change and to increase ambition for climate action. And as Emily mentioned, we have several members, including national governments, several US states and provinces, cities, ports, tribes, and First Nations, as well as what we call affiliate members, which are sort of these, you could imagine science institutions, NGO partners, local academia, and even, seafood growers or industry partners that we're trying to expand that type of relationship with. And again, to grow this community practice of what it means to manage our ocean and coasts in the context of climate change. And so one thing that I'll just start out saying, as we're talking about biodiversity, often in the international conversations that I'm exposed to, we sort of think like, what is the greatest threat facing our ocean? And often the response that I hear from policymakers or from NGOs is plastic or overfishing. And of course that all, makes sense. Those are big threats, but it always drives me crazy because I want to say climate change, and increasing acidification caused by carbon is the greatest threat, existentially facing our ocean. And it took me a long time to get over this feeling of discontent until an OA researcher in the UK said, well, the greatest threat facing our ocean is actually loss of biodiversity, and how we think about that and how we think about climate change's contributions and ocean acidification contributions to that problem, and how we talk about it a little bit more nuanced and comprehensively in that way. So just throwing that out there as sort of a shift in our own sort of thinking about how we talk about biodiversity. And I think what that has meant in the OA community is that we actually are kind of moving away from just awareness to action on this topic, or we're moving from awareness into action taking. And I mentioned that because we've talked about ocean acidification as a somewhat new field. This is a slide that I stole again from a colleague in the UK that I really like. And it's, I guess, a bit outdated. I could update it, but just showing that, in October of 2003, we had, 17 searches on Google for ocean acidification. And, 5 years ago in 2019, we have nearly, 8 million. And so I think that really says that we are growing in exposure and awareness about this topic. And now is the time to really be talking to policymakers and engaging them, and that's what we're trying to do through the Alliance. Obviously, the CANs work in that way at the national, regional, domestic level in the U.S. to really have a conversation about what it means to measure and manage for this issue, and really moving it into a management and policy space. And at the international level, I'll just say, we do have frameworks that already, that OA Action will support international frameworks, or where we have a couple, I wouldn't even call them indicators in the way that this team will think about indicators, but targets for thinking about ocean acidification internationally or globally. So I won't go into all of these. I'll just call out that the UN Sustainable Development Goal agenda has Goal 14, Life Below Water, or the Ocean Goal, that has a OA target to minimize and address ocean acidification and try to get global reporting going through that metric. The UNFCCC, or the UN Framework on Climate Change, has now an ocean climate dialogue that has an opportunity now to really examine how OA mitigation and adaptation can be prioritized across the UNFCCC. And then, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity has multiple targets that are relative to climate change pressures and ocean acidification expressly. And then I'll talk a little bit about the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which now has an OA research program that we're trying to really make sure that we're globally defining OA research for purpose. And I think what's true at the international level is true at the US state level. And in fact, the US states are actually leading the way in defining and helping us outline these questions. And so, again, at the international level, it's true as well as domestic. It's that OA is really a multi-sectoral issue. And just as Nathan's sort of slide around ecosystem services described, it's really relevant to all these sectors. Ocean acidification impacts the way we think about climate mitigation and adaptation, ocean and land management, food security and sovereignty, blue economies, aquaculture, fisheries, coastal resilience. Nathan, I added tourism and recreation after your slide because I thought, oh yes. And that all of this really thinks about favoring, we have policies and priorities around biodiversity being good, and that, preserving biodiversity has consequences for all of these sectors, and usually a preference for ecosystem-based approach to management. And so the way that we've tried to think about this with engaging policymakers is just making sure that we can start where they are, help them understand that action on ocean acidification is relevant to supporting some of these existing priorities. So in this case, strong ocean economies and blue economies, jobs and livelihoods, food security, etc. That action can be taken now, that we have lots of activities that we can do in the near term and the long term to support resilience around our coastline, including reducing CO2 emissions, the #1 cause, and that, action supports these high-level international commitments, but also these local commitments having to do with climate, with biodiversity, and with blue economies. And so that kind of leads us into our next phase of, okay, we're aware of sort of the significance of this issue on some of these sectors and some of these ecosystem services, but how do we start to outline OA information for real decision making at a coastal zone margin, or within an exclusive economic zone? And really the OA policy questions that we get most from, policymakers or resource managers that we're talking to are the same that you would probably get in any field, right? What is the problem? What can be done? What can be done now versus what can be done later? Is this a 2-year problem within my next election cycle? Is this a 5-year problem? Is this a 50-year problem? And how do we think about actions at those different scales? And how do we think in this context about observing, monitoring, and research that's going to be needed to inform actions at those different scales? And then again, as we said, how will this work accomplish or enhance existing goals or targets we already have around sectors or management practices? And through the UN Decade of Ocean Science, we've started to outline this a little bit more and try to give at least the OA community of practitioners a global framework for thinking about co-design of science for purpose. And I think that's one of the themes of this webinar is how do we think about science, co-design for specific outcomes. So this is just the first page of an infographic that's in the chat. You can check it out, and there's a bigger community of practice around OARS, the OA research program at the UN decade level, looking at this. But it really is trying to identify that, yes, targeted information can help policymakers, resource managers, stakeholders, or communities better understand the impacts of OA on our marine resources and enable them to identify the most appropriate mitigation or adaptation actions in their area. And of course, all these projects are going to require considerations of time, space, and cost constraints, aligning with existing policy or management goals, and then assessing sort of the broader context of environmental or socioeconomic risks and benefits. And so to do that, we've really tried to outline some specific decision-making categories that will help almost build a bridge between policymakers and resource managers, and in this case, an OA science community of practitioners, to help think about what co-design projects serve outcomes best. And so I'll just walk through on the left-hand side our decision-making categories that we have kind of arrived to. The first is simply evaluating the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions and on human and ocean health and resources, right? So that's partly just calling for global, regional, local reduction of carbon emissions because we can articulate what it's doing to our oceans and coasts. Partly it's improving climate risk and vulnerability assessments, right? And so thinking about, or marine, ocean risks and vulnerability assessments in the context of climate change. The second, increased food security and resilience of seafood economies. I think that's self-explanatory, but just really trying to think about, we have these policy and management goals around climate resilient fisheries and climate resilient management, or coral reef resilience, or shellfish hatchery practices. What information is informing those management levers, and how do we think about that a little bit more holistically? The third, utilizing marine management tools to protect and restore biodiversity. So that's kind of your mainstream conservation, things like guided, how does OA information help inform more instruction around locations for targeted regulations, seasonal closures, MPAs, or in some case, marine spatial planning. So that's something that we really want to make sure that the research community is helping to inform. Number 4, blue carbon habitat or blue carbon sequestration projects, or just using submerged aquatic vegetation as a way to think about impacting carbon cycle, Nathan, as you were describing, but obviously it's a little bit different, but thinking about how we support sequestration goals, but also just guide the use of natural shorelines, coastal marine habitat to support ecosystem resilience, using the ability for some of these ecosystems to sequester and in some cases store carbon. Number 5, applying local remediation strategies through the reduction of coastal pressures and land-based pollution. So how do we think about OA information helping us improve water quality, identifying OA hotspots, areas that are better or worse based upon multiple factors, but including examining that local source pollution of wastewater, nitrates, nutrients, of course, that create myriad problems in the context of other problems that you all well know about. And then finally, this is definitely a brand new field, thinking about how does OA information help us assess potential risks, benefits, monitoring, or evaluation needs of carbon dioxide removal strategies. So a lot of not necessarily governments, but private sector have really been starting to invest money, and of course NOAA at the national level investing some research money around marine carbon dioxide removal, ocean alkalinity enhancement. What type of information do we need? What kind of baseline do we need to even evaluate what the biological impacts, biological diversity impacts are from some of those activities? So that's sort of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, and if you want to find out more about it, you can definitely go to the website and take a look. So that's sort of OA information for management purpose, for different things that you would do differently around a coastal zone margin to manage for acidification. But how do we think about this, codifying those management activities into existing OA policy or domestic OA policy? And so that's where the OA Alliance has created what we call sort of this OA action plan framework. And this is really trying to get governments at any level, national or US state, to think about actions that they are taking or need to be taking to better understand impacts of OA, along their coastline in their region, and really accelerate those OA mitigation, adaptation, and resilience strategies near shore. And so it's way too much to go to a government and say, what's your plan for reducing ocean acidification? No government can tell you that. And so we've tried to really break down the buckets, right, and sort of some key themes that will help them get started. So a lot of that is around advancing that scientific research agenda, thinking about these, how do we put different data layers together? How do we think about what we're measuring? How do we think about what we need to prioritize for gaps analysis, as Nathan was saying? And so that's a big part of how we're trying to get governments to think about those questions in the context of those policy outcomes or management outcomes that we're looking for. The second, reducing atmospheric CO2 emissions, that goes without saying. Reducing land-based pollutions, which I just described, thinking about how that land-sea interface is affecting or accelerating coastal acidification. Building adaptation and resiliency strategies, which we just kind of covered a couple of what those might look like. Expanding public awareness, that's a huge one, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And that is with policymakers, but also with other scientists. I think even in the OA field of practitioners, we're still siloed, and really thinking about what it means to have a multi-stressor lens to this issue, and even thinking about linking with other observing systems to make sure that we have a holistic way that we're approaching this topic. And a lot of that is about communication across fields. And then finally, building sustained international support. That's for raising the issue, making sure that people are aware of why this needs to be on a research agenda, why it needs to be on a management agenda, and also why we need to fund it adequately at different scales in the near term and in the long term. And so just some quick examples for you. We do have OA action plans that you can look at on the website. Maryland is probably the closest in your neck of the woods that has an OA action plan, followed maybe by New York, but a lot of the mid-Atlantic states are starting to build out what that would look like for them. We have lots of West Coast examples and then some international ones. So I encourage you to check those out if you're interested in thinking or seeing like how states have articulated what their concerns are, what their research needs are, what research they're already conducting, what monitoring they already have going, or the suite of resources that data information that they rely on up to and including, of course, the OOSs and the CANs. I should have said, and I did not, is that the US government actually has now a national OA action plan that is available to go check out, probably with a quick Google search, or it's also on our website under action plans. And that might be informative also for thinking about the regional approach to how groups like the OOSs and the CANs are approaching this work in service of those types of national strategies. And then at the national level, we have policy guidance using some really key policy structures that governments are already using to manage resources or to think about climate mitigation and adaptation. So I won't belabor them here for this audience, but all to say that we are really trying to help governments think about how they would incorporate OA information and needs for OA information in these strategies. And one example is in this shared European strategy that is shared across all countries of the EU. They do something every couple of years where they report on good environmental status of their marine waters. And they take into account lots of different criteria and think about impacts to biodiversity, impacts to food webs, just everything that Nathan was saying in that first presentation. And we're really trying to say that without having more concrete information around, in this case, acidification, you really don't have a better, you need to improve our awareness of what it means to monitor and measure good environmental status in the context of climate change. And so adding these types of parameters is one way to do that, to get started. But of course, there's many other things to think about in the context of climate change. But this is, of course, what we're offering and suggesting from our perspective. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on, communication and knowledge sharing. One way that, the Alliance really tries to do this is painting the entire picture, right? It's not just ocean acidification by itself. We really need to talk about the full impacts of climate change, including a warming ocean, a less oxygenated ocean, including all of the sort of different I guess, trends and conditions that Nathan and other colleagues, are exploring in this context. And so how do we really paint that picture and talk about why that has an impact on ecosystems and species? And then just as Nathan was saying, tying that to ecosystem services. And that's really a way that we're trying to communicate why acidification is one piece of this puzzle, and adding a research agenda accordingly is important. At the US level, we also have done these really fun things called OA story maps, and we've been partnering with US Aquarium all across the United States. So US Aquarium, many of them are part of something called the Aquarium Conservation Partnership. They have banded together to talk about how they communicate climate change and ocean change to their visitors when they come to the aquarium. And so last year we formed a partnership with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, as well as the Aquarium Conservation Partnership, and put together 6 different story maps that really walk visitors of an aquarium through a changing ocean and really try to explain what is ocean acidification and why does it matter for resources and ecosystem services and people. And so we do have them for the South Atlantic. We do have them for the Gulf of Mexico. They are in your chat. So if you want to check them out, please do. And because of time, I will just quickly run through them and then end for questions. All to say, we kind of talk about, food sources and ecosystems being under threat because of climate change, and that matters for our charismatic species, of course, that we see at aquaria. We talk a little bit about multiple stressors in addition to acidification, local conditions, and in each region, what is unique and why small changes can have a big impact on humans, looking at some of the different research projects that are happening in the area with links to them, and then moving on to some calls to action. So I think that's where I'll pause and just turn it over to you, Emily, and say thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. I have a friend with me here. Sorry about that. You did a wonderful presentation, and thank you to Nathan as well. Now I would like to open the floor to any questions. I do like the idea of having people turn their camera on and ask the question personally. So if you're comfortable with doing that, feel free to turn your camera on and raise your hand, and I will try to select people in order. If you're not comfortable with that, you're welcome to put any questions in the chat so that we can get to you then.
Emily, as you wait for, oh, never mind, I see a hand pop up. You're muted, Jen.
Hi, Nathan. I have sort of been following eDNA, sort of from this emerging technology to technology that's becoming a lot more well used within the MBON community. How, I'm not sure if you can answer this though, because I know you don't know every one of the 10 or 11. But how widely used is it now to help with having a better understanding of biodiversity within the regions in which they're working? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, in terms of how many of the MBON projects are using it, I believe it's almost all of them. Frank can probably put in the chat if he knows specifically. Frank Miller-Carter, project lead, is present today. But that was one of the reasons why it was identified in a couple of these working groups. As one, there is an eDNA working group within MBON because there are so many groups doing it. And then even other working groups have started to try to communicate on the eDNA side, because realizing, oh, this might be a link that really does link across as many of the MBONs as possible. I can speak to us. We certainly use it. I believe the Gulf of Maine is using it in their new iteration. The South Florida folks are using it for sure. The Mid-Atlantic folks that just started, they'll be using it. And then the Arctic folks are using it too. So yeah, I do think, among the technologies, like telemetry is probably one of the ones that isn't being used as much across the MBONs. I would say eDNA is pretty common.
And I do see that we have a question from Frank in the chat, and he's asking Jessie and Nathan Do you have suggestions on how we can better link observing efforts under OA and MBON? And how can we get people in GOON to use standardized data formats for biodiversity observations such as Darwin Core? Yes, if you check out the chat, you can see his exact question. And if either of you have, can answer.
Maybe I can go high level and then pass it to you for technical, Nathan, and speak to Darwin Core. But what I can say, Frank, it's nice to see you. And I totally agree. I mean, I think there have been conversations increasingly around better linking observing efforts and better articulating them as like a package together. I think GOON is the right place where that conversation has started, but I actually think ORS is poorly named, and you know, it's again same with OA Alliance, right? It's very focused on OA, but I do think that there's room for that conversation in either of those locations, and I think it is kind of the next iteration of where we are as an OA research community, to be honest, is moving into sort of that standard formats for biodiversity observations and being able to message cohesively, you know, as kind of pillars of those observing efforts, and why we need to, by integrating them is the most significant thing to be doing. But that would be my only just yes, and GOON and or ORS I think would be open to those next step conversations. But
yeah, I agree. I think just having better coordination, understanding that kind of both sides of the equation are doing incredible amounts of effort and sampling, but how can we coordinate them better? And then, but again, that gets to that idea, well, sometimes you have very specific questions that maybe coordination is going to affect or challenge as well. And then that speaks to the data side of things, where oftentimes we can accomplish a lot, even if we're doing things in our separate silos, as much as we try to, you know, be interdisciplinary. It might be okay if some stuff is still siloed, as long as those data pipelines are efficient and effective in getting them out. So then when I do want OA data, I can grab it. And when someone else wants marine biodiversity data, they can grab it. Now, that does speak to something like eDNA, where, you know, I am not an eDNA expert. This is my, you know, we're doing eDNA now because of the MBON, and we see its power. But that's really been allowing me to see this entire pipeline and entire process. It is not as simple as filter water and it spits out a species list. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made in terms of primers and the bioinformatics workflow, and decisions that you have to make as a researcher that might affect your outcomes. And so that makes it really hard to standardize, because again, you're going to be doing that for question-specific purposes and site-specific purposes. And so I think that's one huge challenge that we're going to have to deal with. And I don't necessarily have the answers. I think a lot of it is just being in with the idea that there's going to be some flexibility here, but we need to document and get data out there and published with all of its warts and flaws, so that it can still be used, even if it's not 100% standardized. And then, you know, MBON has been my first experience with Darwin Core too. And, you know, I think just continuing to promote that data management pipeline and investing in it, where, you know, I've got a PhD and I can't understand some of the code to get things into Darwin Core, for example. We have to rely on others and data management specialists to be able to do that. That's a huge limiting factor for sure, both from a cost standpoint and even just from a feasibility standpoint, but it's absolutely needed. So I guess, you know, I would love a system where it's just super easy to push data online, but I understand why we need this also to be so standard and rigorous if we want to look at global trends as well. So it's hard to thread that needle. And I want to say, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, I was just going to add, I just threw the ORS OA Research for the UN Decade Commitments page in the chat. One thing we can talk about this offline, Nathan and Frank and others that I know are very involved in this discussion, is I actually think examples, you know, I mean, I think even just Nathan, I think people need to see examples of how do we think about combined observing efforts for, to your point, a very specific management outcome. And ORS is like desperate for examples. We want lots of like projects that are coming forward with co-design for specific outcomes in mind. And I think if we could put together one or two, or, you know, I don't know what the state of opportunity is, but I think just having a project example would go a long way. And then starting to think about how that's a different question than you asked, Frank, but I just add that as well, because I think that's the best way in some cases to get started while we're waiting for these larger like communities of practice to come together on some sort of approach to methodology or to data format standardization.
Well, on that note, I do want to say a huge thank you to our speakers for talking in today's webinar, and thank you to everyone who attended today. I did want to point out that we have one more webinar in this series coming up in August, and these are our speakers, and we will be discussing international geobond needs and efforts. That registration will probably go out in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out. And I am going to stop recording, but please feel free to hop on the call, turn on your camera if you want to say hi or ask any more informal questions. I will be hanging out for a little bit if anyone wants to hop in.